Hello, everybody. In this episode of Geo Interview, we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Shweta Singh, an Associate Professor of International Relations at the South Asian University, New Delhi, India. She has also served as the UN Women International Expert on Populism, Nationalism, and Gender, as well as the academic advisor for the UNESCO project on state of prevention of violent extremism through education in South Asia. In today's session, we will be discussing on the subject of gender in global politics. I, Ansh Tyagi, on behalf of our organization, the Geostrata, welcome you, Professor. It indeed is an honor and privilege to have you amongst us. Shall we
Thank you,
start, ma'am?
Ansh. Yes, please go ahead.
And my first question to you is, could you please share your research interests with our audience?
Okay, so my research interests. I'm broadly interested in the field. You just spoke about the discipline of IR. So where am I coming in? What is my entry point to the discipline of IR? I'm broadly interested in what can be classified as feminist international relations. And I think what I'm specifically interested in is how do we study feminist IR in South Asia? And I think within this broad canvas, in terms of what can be classified as feminist IR, over the years, I've been interested in the question of war and violence. And when we're talking about the question of war and violence, I'm looking at it from a feminist standpoint. How do we look at war and violence differently? How do we study war and violence differently? If we were to bring in feminist analysis to the study of war and violence. Uh, Given that I've been interested in questions of war and violence in South Asia, empirically, I would say, or in terms of my field research, I've been focused on Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Sri Lanka. And besides, this field of feminist, I won't say besides, but within this field of feminist IR, within this broad thing about war and violence, I think I've taken a step further, and I'm particularly now intrigued by questions of women, peace, and security agenda. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. And why is it, for instance, normative frameworks like UNHCR 1325 do not actually translate, or why are they not transformative in contexts like South Asia? I mean, if we look at South Asia, there are only three countries which have a national action plan. It's Afghanistan, it's Nepal, and Bangladesh. So, I'm interested in the workings of WPS agenda, what is broadly classified as WPS, Women, Peace, and Security agenda. The second area that I've been working on is broadly around themes of populist radical right and gender. I think at this moment, if you're looking at contemporary global politics, we can rightly really say that this is really a populist moment that has dawned in terms of the many centuries that we've already crossed. So what are the questions of gender and populism that we need to really engage with? Or how does gender and populism, how does our understanding of gender and populism differ in regions like South Asia? And the third important area that I would say that I've been interested and intrigued by is an alternative feminist genealogy of the discipline of IR in South Asia. I think if you all look at South Asia, or if you look at the discipline of IR, there's been marginalization of women's writings, A. And if you're looking at the histories, there's a marginalization of the many histories that constitute South Asia, like feminist writings in South Asia. So what would an alternative feminist genealogy of IR look like from a South Asian lens? So for instance, very often we tend to look at areas like Kautilya's Arthashastra to understand strategic culture, right? That's something that's very popular. But how, for instance, would you go back to Therigatha, a collection of Buddhist poems, and start to think about questions of power or state? So I think an alternative feminist genealogy of IR, that's what I would say I'm interested in. So there are many areas that excite and that continue to intrigue me.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm certain that this will make the subject more clear to our audience. Professor, my next question to you is, what is the orientation of present IR scholarship when one argues that traditional IR concepts such as war and peace, sovereignty and power, and so on are gendered? What What exactly does that signify?
Okay, good question. I think I'm going to start with three questions. What do you study in international relations? Why do you study what you study? And how do you study what you study? Right? So these are important questions that as young researchers, as young minds, we should be thinking about. What, why, and how.
How?
And if you're thinking about the what, why, and how, mostly where do we start our story from? So if you're thinking about the discipline of IR, we tend to be just think about, if you were to begin a story, what are the keywords that would come to your mind? The keywords as students of IR, some of the keywords that might come to your mind is state, security, right? Violence, war, peace. Now think of some of the common images that come to your mind. Some of the common images that would come to your mind is battlegrounds, militaries, nukes, territorial borders. Nudge yourself and ask, is this what is IR? And I think this is just part of the story, all right? So if you're looking at what constitutes IR, you first need to problematize what is international. What is your understanding of international? What constitutes international or global per se? And I think when you're thinking about this, if I go back to my story, traditionally, IR has been focused on a state centric analysis. And how do you look at state? You look at state as a black box, as a black box. All right. There's nothing beyond the state, there is nothing below the state. Conventionally, that's how the discipline of IR has evolved. And of course, in this understanding of a very state centric IR, you're looking at international as anarchic. You're looking at international in the context of state as rational actors who are focused on a security centric narrative, focused on ideas of power defined in terms of military capabilities. Now, whatever I said in the last few minutes, this would define what is called the way the world is, or the way the world is understood through the different paradigms in IR. Right? So there are two different ways of doing international relations. One is which asks the question, the way the world is, or tries to give you an explanation of the way the world is. And the other way of doing IR is the way the world ought to be. The first is explanatory, the second is constitutive. Now, within this story of IR, in terms of conventional images that I just talked about, what have you done? You have de-peopled the discipline of international relations. All right. What do? You're looking at state as an abstraction, you're looking at global as an abstraction, you're looking at structural factors, you're looking at parsimonious theory. But in the process, where are the people? Or if I can be more specific, where are the women in international politics? You've invisibilized women in this story. Now, I think in this story, what feminist IR scholars would do is to pay attention to the everyday, all right? To pay attention to the everyday as political and hence international, right? So there is, you read, you actually, if I can say, you recenter your gaze on the everyday. You recenter your gaze on the mundane. And the moment you start to recenter your gaze on the mundane or the everyday, what are you really looking at? Many sites, actors, levels which have been invisibilized in the story of IR centered around the state. All right. So, in some ways, you've moved beyond the state. And I think in this context, I just want to make a reference to Cynthia Enlow's work, who would talk about feminist curiosity. How do you actually visualize? You need to have this analytical tool called feminist curiosity in ways of looking at what is what, as I said, is called natural or traditional. Start problematizing that. I think one of the challenges with young people is they stop being curious. I think uncuriosity is very dangerous. So I think in that context, start pushing yourself and start to think about this question: does gender matter in IR, and where are the women in IR? So, for instance, going back to this whole notion of how the discipline has been de-peopled, now start to think about war. Can you really think about war, for instance, as experience, war as emotion? Yes, you could. And that's what, for instance, feminist scholars like Christine Sylvester would talk about. Start looking at not just states as the site for war and violence. But if you were to look at bodies as sites of war and violence, how would your analysis of international be different, right? If women's bodies were to become the sites, of war and violence, how would your analysis of war be different? So if you were to look at war not just in an anarchic world, but you start to look at war in terms of women's bodies as the boundary markers of nations, nationalisms, and start to now think about war as experience. So I think what I'm really trying to say is that uh, obviously you need to ask the question, why does gender matter in IR? And when you are asking that question, why does gender matter in IR, you need to rethink the what, why, and how of IR per se, right? I hope that helps.
Yes, Professor, that explains it pretty well. My next question to you is how masculinity and femininity are used as tools of analysis in IR as well as everyday politics and society. How should one wield this tool of analysis and with what kind of expected outcomes?
Okay, excellent question. I think when you're thinking about masculinity and femininity, what do you need to bring back to the center stage of analysis? Start to think about patriarchy, all right? You need to understand how patriarchy plays out in terms of privileging ideas of masculinity. Who's given you this? Who's internalized or normalized certain norms? Who says that men are more rational and women are more emotional? That's these kind of binaries that you're talking about. Who says, for instance, that if you were to look at let's say kitchen spaces, those are not traditional spaces to understand IR. Would you say that? What is this public private dichotomy that you need to problematize? Why are these binaries really problematic? So I think what I'm really trying to say is, again, I think I take recourse to Enlo again, who talks about that you really need to look at this idea of feminist curiosity. Now, what do we understand by feminist curiosity? What is, how do we unpack this idea of feminist curiosity? I think feminist curiosity, as Enlo would say, gives us the tool, or is really this notion of curiosity that provokes serious questioning of the working of masculinized and feminized meanings. And what is it doing in the process? And I think this is the most important part. What is it really doing in the process? It is pushing you to rethink the sites for doing international, right? Or it's pushing you to rethink, for instance, the what, why, and how of IR. And I think that's important. So, for instance, you would conventionally dismiss certain spaces. And how would you dismiss those certain spaces? Think about these words very often, private, domestic, trivial, everyday, mundane. These are words that often come to us. No, this is natural. Who says this is natural? This is private. So when you're talking about, for instance, rape, how is rape used as an instrument of war and violence? Rape traditionally, was it a subject matter of IR? How is it that we start to look at this whole question of rape as a strategic instrument of war? So I think what I'm really trying to push you to say is that you need to visualize the working of masculinity and femininity across different sites and ask how it is operationalized in your everyday, in your mundane spaces. For instance, if you were to talk about military wives, or if you were to talk about diplomats' wives, or if you were to talk about private spaces, you were to talk about, many of you would be wearing all these fancy labels, Nike shoes or Adidas shoes. Have you ever thought about where are they made? Who makes them? How is the political economy really gendered? Think about this word, which Enlo writes in a book. If I was to use these two words, just drawing from her, cheap labor and labor made cheap. What is the difference? If I was to just say cheap labor, does it strike anything in your heads? Probably not. All you say is cheap labor. But said differently, as Enlo puts it, if you were to say labor made cheap, what are the questions that come to our mind? Who makes labor cheap? Where is labor made cheap? It's what are you doing? You're expanding your investigative agenda. Similarly, for instance, if a woman who sends her son to join the military, Is she militarized? Is she part of the process of militarization? Young boys wearing these camouflage uniforms. Think about ideas of militarism and militarization. How are they normalized in a societal context? Uh, how is it that certain values that privilege masculinity? For instance, uh, how do you symbolize strong aggression? All right. If you were to say, if I was to go back to some of the analysis that Carol Cohn has done, for instance, on nuclear politics, all right, and one of the important narratives that comes in terms of the language that is used in the context of nuclear politics, a weak nation who cannot actually, for instance, go ahead and conduct tests should go and wear bangles. So I think what I'm pushing you to think is that start to think about questions of patriarchy. How does patriarchy bring into play questions of femininity and masculinity? How does patriarchy privilege a structural and ideological system that perpetuates masculinity? And why is uncuriosity really dangerous? I think the key word here is be curious. Bring in what is called feminist curiosity.
That was really insightful. My next question to you is, how can we look at the rise of global populism through a gendered frame of analysis? What are some phenomena and trends to keep in mind in this respect?
I think if you're looking at it, around us right now, I would really say this is the populist movement in global politics. And what is populism? I mean, I go back to Leclau here. Populism is centered around the idea of people. Different scholars have defined populism differently. Some scholars would define populism as a thin-centered ideology. Others would define populism in more discursive terms and says that it revolves around the idea of people. Now, when you start to think about this idea of people, I think it's interesting how you bring in gender to this analysis. How does gender intersect with populism, particularly populist radical right? It's very interesting that there is a complex intersection of gender with populist radical right. For instance, how do women's bodies become sites for us and them? Have you thought about this question? For instance, in the populist right discourse, how do you really construct the idea of our woman, the pure woman? Because if you're looking at populism, it's the pure people against the corrupt other or the impure other. Now, when you're trying to construct this pure people, how do you start constructing a narrative which is gendered and which centers around women's bodies? And how do women's bodies, for instance, again becomes the boundary markers of us and them? So, there is this whole politics of othering. So, for instance, when Trump would talk about anti-immigration narrative, all right, go back to Trump's narrative, saving the white women from the brown immigrant, the brown Muslim immigrant, maybe, or look at the discourse in South Asia around populist radical right. Different ways it's been shaping up. Masculinity, you also have to look at the workings of masculinity in this discourse on populism. And I think what you really need to go back to is that, as I said, if you're trying to understand populism and gender, don't look at gender as a monolithic category. Look at gender from an intersectional frame. Gender, so populism intersects with gender, but gender also, it's not a monolithic template, and you need to look at it in terms of its, intersectional relationship with differing identities, if I can say. So caste, class, religion. So gender is not really monolithic. So you need to bring in what I call an intersectional lens to the analysis of gender and populism, right? It's more complicated. It's hard to put it in a couple of lines.
Professor, you talked about patriarchal ideas in the field of international relations. So, my next question to you is, what are some instances in the present international governance and security architecture which reflect these patriarchal ideas and legacies?
I think this is again something that we really need to look at it in terms of the history of institutions itself. What is, for instance, how do we define power in the context of international governance and security architecture? Just reflect on the ideas of power. More often than not, power still is centered around ideas of control. start to think about an alternative definition of power. For instance, if you were to bring in Hannah Arendt, power would be the ability to act in concert. But do we really look at power through these alternative prisms? Actually, no. Now, let's go back to one of the key institutions, which is the United Nations. And let's look at the United Nations Security Council. Now, within the context of the United Nations Security Council, for the first time in the year 2000, the Security Council, the UNHCR resolution 1325 was passed. And for the first time, it was recognized that conflict impacts men and women differently. And there were four P's that were foregrounded. For instance, participation, peace building, prosecution, four different P's that were foregrounded as part of this normative framework. Today, we would say that it's been 22 years since the passing of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. And as I said earlier, and this is an important resolution, if we're looking at governance and security architecture, this is a very important normative framework. Now, as I said right at the beginning, let's look at how this is operationalized. Different countries are supposed to adopt it. If they're signatories, they have a national action plan. Now, let me give you an example, and I'm going this question of how patriarchy operates. Afghanistan had a national action plan, and before the Taliban took over, in 2017, I was in Kabul and I was looking at, how, for instance, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is translating on ground. And this is very interesting, more women on the peace table. This would be a part of the WPS agenda. Now, the WPS agenda guarantees participation, but it's interesting that many women who were part of different, for instance, provincial peace committees, they were sitting on those provincial peace committees along with ulemas, with warlords. And one of the things that they were said is, if you travel, for instance, to different provinces, you need to have a male accompaniment. Now, that's part of the patriarchal culture that we are struggling with in the context of the workings of even normative frameworks like 1325. Now, you put across this idea of participation, but you don't really see how participation is inhibited by patriarchal legacies that operate at different levels: global, national, subnational, local. So patriarchy is something that cuts across the different levels. And that's why I keep saying that, you need to pay attention not just to international security and governance architecture at the level of global, but how this translates or not translates at the level of the everyday. Start paying attention to what is mundane within this. And another example, if I can give you, since we are talking about Afghanistan, after the Taliban's takeover, and we were looking at different resolutions that were passed, and you're looking at the great powers, you really need to see how, for instance, women's rights are abdicated in the name of interests. So first there was this whole narrative, for instance, which United States of America had in terms of intervention in Afghanistan, that they are there to protect the brown Afghan woman. But the minute they start to withdraw, they abdicate their responsibility to protect the brown woman. So, it's quite complex in terms of how it operates. So normatively, what I'm trying to say is, normatively, there have been many firsts, in terms of addressing issues of privileging masculinity, for instance, different normative frameworks that we are talking about. But I think what we are still struggling with is that they continue to impinge the functioning of international governance and security structures. I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense, Professor. My next question to you is, how can we operationalize gender while studying the relationship of marginalized communities with the nation state and international politics, as you talked about Afghanistan and the status of women there?
I think that's a very important question that you're asking, especially in the context of South Asia. And I think I always say that when you're thinking about gender and IR, and this is where I think for us in the region, this is an important question. You need to recognize that there is no singular feminist IR. There's no singular template to understand feminist international relations. And if you're thinking about feminist international relations in South Asia, and I'll then come to your question, if you're thinking about feminist international relations in South Asia, I think it's being marked by what I call dialogue, difference, and dissidence with the global north. And the idea of difference is important here. Why is this idea of difference important? Because again, what we need to really look at is that gender is not a monolithic concept. It's not a monolithic category that we're looking at. Gender intersects with caste, class, religion, region. Now, the minute I start to talk about, how gender intersects with caste, class, religion, and region, you need to look at the histories of post-colonial states in South Asia. For instance, you have to look at, at the whole politics around post-colonial anxieties, the histories of post-colonial states, nationalisms, not in the singular, but in the plural, the journey of the trajectory of nationalism, and how it has, how it really intersects with gender, not the monolithic aspect of it, but the intersectional filter that centers around gender. And I think in that context, you have to start thinking about, for instance, when you say, how does gender, how would you operationalize gender while studying the relationship of marginalized community? Ask yourself this question: how would the experience, for instance, of a Tajik woman be different from a Hazara woman or a Pashtun woman? How would the experience, for instance, of a Sinhala woman be different from a Tamil woman? Or how within the Tamil community, in Sri Lanka, how within this category the experiences of a Tamil Hindu woman be different from a Tamil Muslim woman? So what am I trying to say? I'm really bringing this intersection, this intersectional play of which is really there at the margins. And when I say intersectional play, caste, class, region, religion, all of this intersects with gender, right? So different kinds of marginalizations that you're talking about. And as I said, that is why it's very, very important that don't look at understanding feminist IR or gender and IR in South Asia from a singular frame. Look at it with, your gaze should be really in terms of understanding the idea of difference. And I think feminist curiosity becomes even more important when we are thinking about those questions.
That makes it pretty clear, Professor. So, my next question is, given the conversation we have had, what should be the way forward for international relations?
Just be curious. Start to think of, don't be uncurious. That's something that I really want to emphasize. And I think I'm just borrowing from Menlo here. Start to think about, things that have been on the margins, actors, issues, sites, something which you would consider as natural, traditional. Start to ask questions. Start to ask the what, why, how. Don't be uncurious. It's extremely dangerous. If you're uncurious, you need to start thinking, whose agenda am I serving? Whose power am I aligning with? Why am I uncurious about it? I'm sure in many instances in your everyday lives, start to think about, the why, what, and when of those little threads that you have. And would you think that there is scope for it to be international, or why is it that it's not been recognized as international? So, for instance, I often say this. When you start to think about, for instance, during the pandemic, and I can go back to Delhi University days or in that context, outside Delhi University colleges, there are usually, these small stalls for tea or little nibbles around university colleges. Have you ever thought about whether, how has the pandemic impacted stall owners who are men and women differently? Or how have they been invisibilized? What is the gendered political economy, for instance, of labor? So what I'm trying to say is start being curious and visualize the workings of femininity and masculinity. And to repeat myself, just don't be uncurious. Expand your investigative agenda. That's the way forward. Don't look beyond the state and ask the question, where are the women?
Thanks, Professor, for that answer. It was extremely insightful. So, my last question to you: you have such a long experience in the field of international relations. How has your journey been in the field of academia and research?
I think it's been very, very enriching and something that, and I'm still learning. I consider myself in a constant mode of learning and engaging with these questions. I always say that, in so many ways, I have learned from the field. I think one of my, one of the things that I always say is, and I say this to young people, especially who are inclined towards the discipline of IR, move away from just desk-based research. Start to, push yourself beyond desk-based, computer-centric research, and be out there in the field. Learn from the field. So if you're interested in questions of war and violence, don't be people IR. And so I would say, in terms of my own journey, I think it's been very enriching. And as I shared with you right at the beginning, I started off of teaching in the Department of Political Science in LSR, and then I moved to South Asian University. And I think this is a very, very special space for me, because I think uh, if you really want to learn about IR and the region, this is the space you have to be in. Because I think, uh, what do we understand by South Asia? How does South Asia play out in the global? You see that in your classroom spaces. And what better space than your classroom spaces to learn from young minds? So it's been a very, very enriching journey.
We will try to learn from your experiences, Professor.
Thank you so much, Ansh. It's been wonderful engaging with your team, with you, with Ashish, Harsh, and Pratyaksh. And more power to all of you in terms of taking this work forward. And good luck with everything.
Thank you so much, Professor. It indeed was our honor and privilege to host you. And we are looking forward to host you sometime again.